Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Blue Imaginarium's Wordplay. I'm Cara, and today I'm going to be sharing a few stories that I have loved, some since my childhood and some in more recent times, but all of them have spoken to me, and I wanted to share them with you today. The first one we're going to be diving into is one of my favorite authors, Toni Morrison. She recently passed a couple of years ago. Very sad about that, but she left the world with a legacy of amazing, really amazing words and novels and stories and characters and settings. So she's been one of my favorite authors since college. I actually did my undergraduate thesis on her, comparing her work with Doris Lessing's, who is a British author, so very different styles and themes. And yet I was able to really compare and contrast a lot of their philosophies on self-realization and that kind of thing. So love Toni Morrison. The first one we're going to be doing today is Toni Morrison's Beloved, one of my favorite of her many novels. So let's dive in. Beloved. 124 was spiteful, full of baby's venom. The women in the house knew it, and so did the children. For years, each put up with a spite in his own way. But by 1873, Sethi and her daughter Denver were its only victims. The grandmother, Baby Suggs, was dead. And the sons, Howard and Bugler, had run away by the time they were 13 years old. As soon as merely looking in a mirror shattered it, that was the signal for Bugler. As soon as 2 tiny handprints appeared in the cake, that was it for Howard. Neither boy waited to see more. Another kettleful of chickpeas smoking in a heap on the floor, soda crackers crumbled and strewn in a line next to the doorsill. Nor did they wait for one of the relief periods, the weeks, months even, when nothing was disturbed. No, each one fled at once, the moment the house committed what was for him the one insult not to be borne or witnessed a second time. Within 2 months, in the dead of winter, leaving their grandmother, Baby Suggs, Sethi, their mother, and their little sister Denver, all by themselves in the gray and white house on Bluestone Road. It didn't have a number then, because Cincinnati didn't stretch out that far. In fact, Ohio had been calling itself a state only 70 years, when first one brother and then the next stuffed quilt packing into his hat, snatched up his shoes, and crept away from the lively spite the house felt for them. Baby Suggs didn't even raise her head. From her sick bed, she heard them go, but that wasn't the reason she lay still. It was a wonder that her grandsons had taken so long to realize that every house wasn't like the one on Bluestone Road. Suspended between the nastiness of life and the meanness of the dead, she couldn't get interested in leaving life or living it, let alone the fright of 2 creeping off boys. Her past had been like her present, intolerable. And since they knew death was anything but forgiveness, she used the little energy left for pondering color. Bring a little lavender in if you got any, pink if you don't. And Sethi would oblige her with anything from fabric to her own tongue. Winter in Ohio was especially rough if you had an appetite for color. Sky provided the only drama, and counting on a Cincinnati horizon for life's principal joy was reckless indeed. So Sethi and the girl Denver did what they could, and what the house permitted, for her. Together they waged a perfunctory battle against the outrageous behavior of that place, against turned-over slop jars, smacks on the behind, and gusts of sour air, for they understood the source of the outrage, as well as they knew the source of light. Baby Suggs died shortly after the brothers left, with no interest whatsoever in their leave-taking or hers. And right afterwards, Sethi and Denver decided to end the persecution by calling forth the ghost that tried them so. Perhaps a conversation, they thought, an exchange of views or something would help. So they held hands and said, come on, you may as well just come on. The sideboard took a step forward, but nothing else did. Grandma Baby must be stopping it, said Denver. She was 10 and still mad at Baby Suggs for dying. Sethi opened her eyes. I doubt that, she said. Then why don't it come? You've forgotten how little it is, said her mother. She wasn't even 2 years old when she died. Too little to understand. Too little to talk much, even. Maybe she don't want to understand, said Denver. Maybe. But if she'd only come, I could make it clear to her. Sethi released her daughter's hand, and together they pushed the sideboard back against the wall. Outside, a driver whipped his horse into the gallop. Local people felt necessary when they passed 124. For a baby, she throws a powerful spell, said Denver. No more powerful than the way I loved her, Sethi answered. So there is, oh my gosh, Toni Morrison. Yeah. So you can tell this is about a haunted house, and it's about a family and all the things that are going to come up with this. But it starts with a haunted house, and I'll never forget the first time I read this. I read this first page or two several times, like, whoa, she's talking about a house, and this house has personality, and now you realize that it's a ghost, and it's a ghost of a baby, and like, wow, what's going to happen in this novel? So if you have not read Toni Morrison, I highly recommend her. Any of her novels are astounding, and yeah, she's one of my favorites. So next we're going to move on to, it's actually nonfiction, because sometimes nonfiction, I think, can be as lyrical and as storytelling as fiction. And I think, in my opinion, the best nonfiction is that way. It's really telling a story. It might be a truthful story instead of a made up story as in fiction. But to me, the best nonfiction has that storytelling quality. So this is from, it's called Broken Open by Elizabeth Lesser. And this book, I first read it about 15 years, 20 years ago, when I was in a place in my life where I was facing a lot of change and what to do next, and some really big things were happening in my life. And I found this book, I'm not sure how, but it really changed the trajectory of that. And it was the first time I ever realized that you can use pain and struggle as a launch pad for growth. It doesn't have to pull you down. You don't have to keep it with you. It can really be an impetus and a change point to help you get to a better place. So since then, I've reread it. When my parents passed, I reread it, and it helps in many ways. I've also gifted it to a lot of people who are in a struggle of one kind or another, and they have let me know that it has helped them as well. So I hope you enjoy this. And this is, again, Broken Open by Elizabeth Lesser. Some years ago, I took a trip to the city of Jerusalem, where centuries are layered in stones and streets are carved into the layers, twisting and turning in haphazard patterns that divide and connect neighborhoods, markets, mosques, temples, and churches. One morning in that broken city, I sat alone on a well-worn wall at the base of the Mount of Olives. The day was moving forward with the kind of determination that comes from people with places to go and things to do. Religious pilgrims pushed past each other into the gates of the holy city. Men and women made their way to work and market. Children ran past them to school, but I had nowhere to go. The group I was traveling with in Jerusalem had risen early for the day's planned itinerary. I had stayed behind. I could no longer keep up the charade that I was part of their adventure. I wasn't here to visit sacred sites, or to walk the stations of the cross, wail at the Western Wall, or chant the 99 names of Allah. No, I was here to further delay making a decision about my life at home. I had come to Jerusalem only because my friend, who was leading the trip, was worried enough about me to pay my fare, which worried me enough to fly halfway around the world to a city as mixed up as myself. Now I was here, but I was really back there, at home in New York, scared and confused about my crumbling marriage. Wandering deeper into the walled old city, I came to an ancient alleyway lined with shops selling religious artifacts for the Western pilgrim. Normally, I would veer away from these kind of stores. Inspirational sayings stitched in needlepoint or Virgin Mary coffee mugs seem no different to me than those velvet Elvis paintings you see at flea markets. But I needed help. I needed inspiration, even from a coffee cup or an embroidered pillow or from Elvis himself. One narrow, dusky shop appealed to me, and I went in. On the floor was a patchwork of Persian rugs. On the walls hung small paintings, some of saints and prophets, others of mountains and flowers. Was this a gallery, a rug store, a thrift shop? I couldn't tell. In the back of the long room, drinking tea at a low table, sat two Arab men dressed in white kaftans. One was stooped and aged gentleman, and the other, his son perhaps, was a mysterious-looking character with gleaming eyes and long black hair, like the mane of a well-groomed horse. After a while, the son put down his tea and came forward to greet me. Fixing his gaze on me, as if trying to read the secrets of my heart or the contents of my purse, he said in perfect English, "Come, you will like this picture." Taking my hand, he led me around the piles of rugs to the back of the store, near where his father was sitting. The old man stood and shuffled over to meet me. He placed his right hand on his heart and bowed his head in the traditional Islamic greeting. "Look," he said, pointing at a small painting hanging on the wall. He touched my arm with the kindness of a grandfather. "See the rose?" he asked, turning me toward the picture. There, framed in dark wood, was the ethereal image of a rosebud with shimmering pale petals, holding one another in a tight embrace. Under the flower was an inscription that read, "And the time came when the risk to remain tight in a bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom." Unexpected tears stung my eyes as I read the words. The two men hovered around me, more like bodyguards than salesmen. I turned away from them, hiding my face in the shadows. I was afraid that if the old man showed me one more ounce of mercy, I would break down in a stranger's store thousands of miles from home. "What's wrong?" the long-haired man asked. "Nothing is wrong," I said. "I'm fine." "No, something is wrong," the man said. "You're in pain." "What do you mean?" I asked, suspicious yet curious. Was he a con man trying to sell me the painting? Or was my heartache that palpable, my story so easily read? I felt exposed, as if the long-haired man was a spy of the soul who knew all about my marriage, my two little boys, and the crazy mess my husband and I had made of our life together. "What do you mean?" I asked again. I looked at the men. They stared back at me. We stood in silence. And then the long-haired man repeated, "You are in pain. Do you know why?" "No, why?" I asked, even though I certainly did know why. "Because you're afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid of yourself," the man said, placing his hand on his chest and patting his heart. "You're afraid to feel your real feelings. You're afraid to want what you really want." "What do you want?" "You mean the painting? You think I want the painting?" I asked suddenly, confused and desperate to get away from the smell of the rugs and the intensity of the man. "I don't want the painting," I said, making my way toward the door. The man followed me to the front of the shop. He stood directly in front of me, took my own hand, and put it over my heart. "I don't mean the painting," he said kindly. "I mean what the painting says. I mean that your heart is like the flower. Let it break open. What you want is waiting for you in your own heart. The time has come. May Allah bless you." Then he slipped back into the darkness. I pulled open the door, stepped out into the bright and bustling day, and wound my way through the circling streets to my hotel. Once in my room, though it was noon and 90 degrees, I ran a bath. As I tested the tub, the words under the painting echoed through my mind. Somehow the long-haired man had seen into me and named the source of my pain. I was like the rosebud, holding myself together, tight and tense, terrified of breaking open. But the time had come. Even if I was risking everything to blossom, the man was right. It was time for me to find out what I really wanted. Not what my husband wanted, Not what I thought my children needed, not what my parents expected, not what society said was good or bad. It was time for me to step boldly into the fullness of life, with all of its dangers and all of its promises. Remaining tight in a bud had become a kind of death. The time had come to blossom. Like I said, this book has just made a lot of things better, and it puts a lot of sense to the challenges and the struggles that we all go through at various times of life. So I highly recommend it. And if you or someone you care about is going through a challenging time, I really recommend it. It's helped a lot. Lastly, we're going to end with Charlotte's Web. Oh, E.B. White, one of my favorite books since childhood, and I read it every year as an adult because, my goodness, it's one of the best. So, the first chapter. And it's about more than a pig, as you know. It's got a lot of life lessons in here, that's for sure. All right, the first chapter is called Before Breakfast. "Where's Papa going with that axe?" said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. "Out to the hog house," replied Mrs. Arable. "Some pigs were born last night." "I don't see why he needs an axe," continued Fern, who was only 8. "Well," said her mother, "one of the pigs is a runt. It's a very small and weak, and it will never amount to anything. So your father has decided to do away with it." "Do away with it?" shrieked Fern. "You mean kill it, just because it's smaller than the others?" Mrs. Arable put a pitcher of cream on the table. "Don't yell, Fern," she said. "Your father is right. The pig would probably die anyway." Fern pushed a chair out of the way and ran outdoors. The grass was wet and the earth smelled of springtime. Fern's sneakers were sopping wet by the time she caught up with her father. "Please don't kill it," she sobbed. "It's unfair." Mr. Arable stopped walking. "Fern," he said gently, "you'll have to learn to control yourself." "Control myself," yelled Fern. "This is a matter of life and death, and you talk about controlling myself?" Tears ran down her cheeks, and she took hold of the axe and tried to pull it out of her father's hands. "Fern," said Mr. Arable, "I know more about raising a litter of pigs than you do. A weakling makes trouble. Now run along." "But it's unfair," cried Fern. "The pig couldn't help being born small, could it? If I had been very small at birth, would you have killed me?" Mr. Arable smiled. "Certainly not," he said, looking down at his daughter with love. "But this is different. A little girl is one thing. A little runty pig is another." "I see no difference," replied Fern, still hanging on to the axe. "This is the most terrible case of injustice I ever heard of." A queer look came over John Arable's face. He seemed almost ready to cry himself. "All right," he said. "You go back to the house and I'll bring the runt when I come in. I'll let you start it on a bottle like a baby. Then you'll see what trouble a pig can be." When Mr. Arable returned to the house half an hour later, he carried a carton under his arm. Fern was upstairs changing into her sneakers. The kitchen table was set for breakfast, and the room smelled of coffee, bacon, damp plaster, and wood smoke from the stove. "Put it on her chair," said Mrs. Arable. Mr. Arable set the carton down at Fern's place. Then he walked to the sink and washed his hands and dried them on the roller towel. Fern came slowly down the stairs. Her eyes were red from crying. As she approached her chair, the carton wobbled, and there was a scratching noise. Fern looked at her father. Then she lifted the lid of the carton. There, inside, looking up at her, was the newborn pig. It was a white one. The morning light shone through its ears, turning them pink. "He's yours, Mr. Arable, same from an untimely death. And may the good Lord forgive me for this foolishness." So that is the start of Charlotte's Web. So if you haven't read it, if somehow your childhood did not include that book, I highly recommend it as an adult. And like I said, I read it every year. It's got a lot of depth. And eventually you meet spiders and sheep, and there's a goose and a lot of other beautiful animals. So highly recommend that as well. So thank you for joining today. on Blue Imaginarium's WordPlay. I encourage you to continue to join us. Follow our social at Blue Imaginarium. We have some films out there, one on penguins, one coming soon on winter, and much more coming. A lot of art, a lot of words, playing with both of those concepts. So welcome to Blue Imaginarium, and we'll see you in the next episode.